Thank you. My name is Eddie Radan, as Thomas said. After graduating from the Academy of Arts, Theology and Philosophy, I dedicated myself to the inter and transdisciplinary research in the field of social sciences and humanities, in addition to teaching School of Building and Crafts here in Croatia. I have also participated in several international scientific conferences on topics related to the bioethics and Renaissance philosophy. Also, my artwork was exhibited in a number of art exhibitions, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to present the topic at such an interesting conference that emphasizes the philosophical background and the multi-layered aspect of the Warhammer, which definitely exceeds the genre of the classic tabletop game and provides an opportunity for possible collaboration among the Warhammer fans from the global scientific community. In this presentation entitled Monarchy and Biopolitics, Political Power and Somatic Modifications, using the example from the Warhammer 40k universe, we want to address the connection between political power and somatic modifications, using the example of the monarchy in Period of Man from the grimdark Warhammer 40k universe, which raises the question of the nature and extent of political control over the human body and its use for the purpose of power projection. This presentation uses the concept biopolitics as popularized by the philosopher Michel Foucault, who emphasized that the intervention in the physical component of the human being, which is connected to the other components, opens up space for a redefinition of the term human, as well as for critical reflection on the theocentric worldview and transhumanist anthropology. As we shall see in the case of the Warhammer 40k universe, the biopolitics corresponds with the transhumanist perception of man. This famous 10th century philosopher argues that changes that occurred in the 18th and the 19th centuries have made human life the central problem of politics and wanted to explore the mechanisms by which the fundamental biological characteristics of the human species become the subject of political strategy and the object of intervention. Foucault's interpretation of biopolitics derives from his theory of biopower. Regardless of how its content and modulations are defined, it has no clear basis. In this case, we apply the classical biopolitical discourse that dates back to the John of Salisbury and the Rudolf Kellen, to a monarchical political model that revolves around the sovereign subject axis, as opposed to the political model of the liberalism to which Foucault originally applied bioethics. John of Salisbury did not use the term biopolitics, but his concept of the body politic in his work Polycraticus can be seen as a precursor to the biopolitical thought. Salisbury's analogy of the state as a human body emphasized the cooperative harmony and reciprocal functions of his disparate parts, with a focus of the overall health and the common purpose of the social organism, which shared concern in biopolitics. Salisbury's analogies influenced Swedish political scientist Rudolf Kellen, who coined the term biopolitics. In his organicistic theory, state is viewed as an organic entity that exercises control over the population. His works, such as The State as a Form of Life, emphasized the organicist analogy for the state and focused on the managing a population stock and life itself, which is considered a form of vitalism, and anticipated later Foucault's focus on the state's power over population. Foucault's hypothesis is based on the view that human being constitutes a biological species and can be examined within the juridical disciplinary framework, among other dimensions. In this context, disciplinary power exercised through the sovereign shapes individual identity, regulates their behavior, and describes itself onto their body, a process that in the Warhammer 40k universe is expressed as sacralized political power. The primary subject of biopolitics is the population, conceived as the object of the state surveillance, which penetrates into the very body and corporal forms of life as a new modality of power. Biopolitical power intervenes in the bare lives of the population, legitimizing its own operation under the guise of concern for life in its entirety, thus depriving the individual of his or her natural right to exercise authority over their own life and death. Accordingly, biopolitics is recognized as the only structure of power that can guarantee the prosperity and survival of the human community, its effects being manifested through the activity of political organizations. Employing the distinctive genealogical method as an analysis of provenance or origin, Foucault seeks to demonstrate that the body, as the biopolitical entity par excellence, is not a biological, but rather a political fact. The body is simultaneously the object and the instrument of power. Power produces the body with the ultimate aim of creating an obedient subject, a subject of the regime, for the body itself is a product of the regime. Here we notice parallels with the position of the human body in the context of biopolitics of the Warhammer 40k universe, where the body of subject is primarily perceived through the will of sovereign and the powerful state apparatus and exploits for the purpose of the fulfillment of political goals. Biopolitical discourse is expanding on the example of adeptus mechanicus, who are the followers of the machine god, embracing cybernetic augmentation as a part to ascension, integrating themselves with technology to escape their mortal coils. They view machine-like purity and technological progress as a form of spiritual salvation. In this perspective, the hybrid of machine and human is perceived, among other things, as an expression of the human striving for immortality and deification, which has its roots in the late medieval development of the experimental method and hermetically motivated anthropocentrism of the Renaissance period. The Renaissance stands on the threshold of the modern ages and with a revolutionary view of man contributes to the later mathematizing of nature and the early scientific revolution that occurred at the beginning of the 17th century. During this period, human efforts to transcend their own limitations become more concrete than ever. This shift is characterized by the replacement of the medieval theocentrism with anthropocentrism. Renaissance anthropocentrism, especially within the Florentine Neoplatonist circle that flourished under the patronage of the powerful Medici family, regarded the human being as Deus in terris, which means God on earth, or secundus Deus, second God, and thus radically expanded earlier notions of the human freedom. This conception of freedom found an expression in the natural philosophy, within which the experimental method emerged and progressively refined itself, positioning Renaissance natural philosophy as a form of the pre-science in the modern sense. The Renaissance universal man, l'uomo universale, projected newly acquired knowledge in all directions, thus concretizing the notion of the God-given right to dominate nature through the pre-industrial technology, a development that culminated in the modern scientific revolution. In pursuit of mastering all nature, we see the realization of Baconian ideals expressed in a famous quote, "Scientia potestas est," knowledge is power, and Nietzschean will be power. Since then, science and scientists have been very successful in subjugating natural forces to exploit them not only for the advancement of the human life, but sometimes also against humanity. The impulses driving the universal man of the Renaissance epoch were profoundly shaped by Hermetic anthropology, which is less known, and introduced to the scholarly West through the leading Florentine philosopher and one of the founders of the Florentine Platonic Academy, Marsilio Ficino's translation of the main Hermetic manuscript called Corpus Hermeticum. Renaissance philosophers identified the root of the original wisdom tradition in question with legendary Hellenic syncretic figure combining the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, called Hermes Trismegistus, who is considered the epitome of the ancient Egyptian wisdom depicted in the Corpus Hermeticum. This manuscript articulated an interpretation of humanity that emphasized uniqueness, dominance, and the centrality of freedom, which further encouraged and affirmed the Renaissance philosopher as active participant in the divine process of creation, both through the metaphysical and technical means. Within this framework, we can discern the seeds of a notion that would later blossom into the transhumanist philosophy. Hermetic anthropology coincides with the transhumanist model of the Warhammer 40k universe, mainly due to the spiritual component and the quest for the deification of human being. as exemplified by the tech priests Adeptus Mechanicus. They use technological tools, but also go beyond, with the ultimate goal of deifying humans through the technosphere. Technology is viewed as a tool to achieve spiritual perfection, which in Spengler's words is an example of the Faustian Western man, who wants to be his own god. Just like Spengler, Junger draws parallels between human society and Faustian metaphor, where he notes that now, when the Faustian civilization is completely intertwined with technology, its well-being resists solely on the achievements of technology, and therefore its downfall inextricably linked with technology. He also rejected the idea of neutrality of technology and claims that the man who installs an electric socket may have greater comfort, but he is certainly less independent than the man who lights a kerosene lamp, for example. In his works, Junger argued that technology is not neutral in itself, that its value does not derive solely from the way in which it is used by man. It is not an object can be mastered, used at will. On the contrary, technology carries with it a very specific lifestyle, and man has a choice: accept technology or perish. And when technology becomes part of the state agenda, there is open space to implement anatomopolitics, or in other words, technologically mediated somatic modification. The most blatant example of the programmatic technologically mediated somatic modification for the purpose of projecting sacralized political power, besides Adeptus Mechanicus, is found in the Empire's genetically modified elite units, the Space Marines, where we witness the erasure of some key components of the very concept of humanity, which has an entirely vague meaning when observed through the lens of the transhuman perspective. The theme of the sacrifice and manipulation of the concept of human for the purpose of maintaining and projecting political power through the medium of technology in the grimdark genre of the Warhammer 40k is ironized to the extreme, using the example of the deified and sacralized emperor of all mankind, who has been artificially kept alive by the state apparatus for years. The sacralized political power depicted in the Warhammer 40k universe represents a distinct shift from the Renaissance ambition to dominate and manage nature through the technology toward the issue described by Michel Foucault's biopolitics. In this framework, technology is employed by the state apparatus to exert control over the human being, that is, over bios, life itself, which is regulated and modified to serve the interests of power centers, which encourage transhumanism in embracing social Darwinism through the technological leap, in order to create new type of man, just as philosophers of Renaissance created l'homo universale, man of universal knowledge, man of universal possibilities, which results with preventing man from being perceived as ontological being, in other words, with ontological emptiness. Ontology is replaced now by technology. Confronted with such a reductionist view of humanity and efforts to overcome its limitations, we are inevitably compelled to ask, does the human being lose its humanity in a transhumanist perspective, where the technology of governance intrudes upon the subject's bios and shapes it to fulfill private political agendas, thus treating humans not as ends in themselves, but merely as means for the political programming? We believe that such questions should be further explored through the comprehensive bioethical reflection with the public sphere. Without such discourse, the integrity of the human being, particularly concerning their freedom and dignity, could be jeopardized by unclear value system. By emphasizing the bioethical narrative within the philosophy of technology, we aim to develop corrective frameworks for transformation techniques in the context of the modern technologies, and we want to stimulate critical thinking about the new paradigm of the modern scientific technical society, in which man is losing control over the speed of his achievements. Transhumanist intentions of improving man's physiological, mental, and emotional abilities are welcomed, but provided that they are guided by ethical and axiological awareness and promote the freedom and dignity of the individual. Thank you for your attention.